Welcome to the God is the Issue podcast with Brad Bright. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg. Our view of God determines what we think on all moral, cultural, and economic issues. It even determines how we vote. Hope for the future of our country and our world lies in our ability to make God the issue in every issue. Today, we're talking about the public school system. It was initially developed as a way to make sure everyone got the same training on reading, writing, and math. Where is it today? Where does it leave our kids today? Brad Bright is here today to talk about public education and how we can make God the issue in this conversation. Brad Bright, welcome back to the God is the Issue podcast.
Great to be here, Jim.
Brad, when public education was established, what was at its core purpose?
Well, public education really became widespread in America at about the 1830s. And the goal was to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, some science, and moral character. And the reason why all of these things were important to them is because they believed these things were important to the healthy functioning of a republic. And so the more they could encourage this, the more they made sure everybody could read, write, and do arithmetic and had moral character, the more safe the republic would be. And that was the reason why.
So, what's changed? Because public education today, I don't think they're teaching moral character anymore.
No, first they took out God, because in order to teach moral character, they taught the Bible. That's how they taught moral character, straight from the Bible. So first, the secularists took out God because they didn't like God in there. Well, when you take God out, then of course you have to take moral training out, because there's no basis for moral training without God. But then what finally happened? They even dumbed down public education. Now, if you don't believe me, let me give you a contrast. Today, the average public high school, when 500 seniors graduate, they're excited, they're grateful just to have one National Merit Scholar, right? Okay, my son's school where he went was a small classical Christian school. He had 18 kids in his graduating class. 6 of them were National Merit Scholars, a third of the class. You see, public schools today, they tend to teach the lowest common denominator, and they don't support their teachers. They try to tell their teachers, what you have to teach this and this and this, and you have to do this, this, and this, instead of allowing the teacher really to focus on the students and give the students what they really need. And so we've in effect dumbed down education. And that's too bad, but that's where we are today.
So in the dumbing down of education, what was the process? How did it happen? How did the dumbing down of public education go from being really a moral foundation for our society to where we are today, where public education is often scorned by parents?
Well, we just slowly began removing God, removing some of the core values we had as a nation. I would say probably the critical moment in that was in 1963 with the Abington School District versus Schimpf. It was a case before the Supreme Court. And the court voted. I didn't say make a decision. I said they voted because they're now making law rather than trying to simply enforce the Constitution. The court voted to prohibit Bible reading the Lord's Prayer in school. They said, and this is the key, and he said, here's the reason why. They said it's because any activity in schools, in public schools, has to have a secular purpose. Has to have a secular purpose. In other words, secular speech was given a clear preference over religious speech. And so secularism has now become the philosophy of the classroom, which means God had to be removed, and anything that was a result of teaching God, like morality, also went with it. Well, what happened with that, then, of course, then you had behavioral problems coming into the classroom, and teachers became more babysitter than teacher.
Well, I want to go back because I don't want to jump too far ahead. You mentioned secularism. You make it sound like it's some sort of religion. What's the definition of secularism? What do you mean?
Well, secularism is where you basically exclude God from the conversation, right? It's not necessarily meaning God isn't relevant, but it's where God becomes really irrelevant to the conversation. It's not saying God is bad. It's just saying God is irrelevant. Secularism focuses on humanism, on what we can do, but in effect, it excludes God from the conversation.
But humanism is a religion. I mean, humanism is a religion of everything without God. I mean, isn't it?
It's certainly an ideology. I don't know that you technically would call it a religion, although I think in modern day society it's become a religion of sorts. It's a belief system, just as Christianity, just as any of these have a belief system as a component. You know,
Go ahead.
my brother, a number of years ago, in 1973, his first year in college, he went to Cal State San Bernardino. And this is a kid, smart kid. My brother, by the time he graduated from high school, he'd read everything C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer had written, and he was actually conversant on those levels. So he was a thinker. But I remember chatting with him. It was the end of his first year in college, and he was discouraged because he said, the goal of modern education is to teach people how to live without God. And at the time, I thought, well, okay, I don't understand that. But as I thought about it over the years, I realized he was right then. That was 1973. It's even truer today.
Flesh that out a little bit more. What did your brother mean? I mean, he was experiencing, but what did he mean?
Well, I think the best way to flesh that out is to tell a story of a conversation I had about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. I was at a Christmas party and there was this Jewish couple there. I didn't know it initially. I didn't know them, but we just started chatting. I found out they were Jewish and they knew who my family was, in the evangelical world. But we started chatting. And at one point, the wife, who was a mom, said, my 21-year-old daughter thinks God is irrelevant. She said, I don't understand that. I said, oh, you sent her to public school. She said, well, how do you know that? I said, well, because you said your daughter thinks God is irrelevant. I said, name one course in school where they taught how God was relevant. Did they teach how God was relevant to mathematics, to science, to history, to literature, reading, writing, arithmetic? Did they explain to the students how God was relevant? And she said, well, no. So as I said, in other words, they taught your daughter how to live life without reference to God. And she went, oh. She said, can we talk more? This is a Jewish person talking with an evangelical, and yet she all of a sudden, for the first time, understood that the problem is all those years they've been teaching her daughter how to live without reference to God, and now it was bearing fruit.
You're listening to the God is the Issue podcast with Brad Bright. We're going to be right back with a lot more on this conversation of public education. Is it actually incubating violence because of teaching the irrelevancy of God? We'll be right back.
Want to know more about how you can make God the issue in every issue? Get your copy of Brad's book, God is the Issue. Now in its 3rd edition, you can get your ebook copy at brightmedia.org. Even better, if you subscribe to this podcast, you'll receive a coupon for 1 free download of God is the Issue ebook. Go to brightmedia.org, that's brightmedia.org, and get God is the Issue ebook today.
Hey, welcome back to the God is the Issue podcast with Brad Bright. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg. Today we're talking about public education. What's its purpose? And is it really a place that's incubating violence because of making God irrelevant? All right, Brad, let's back to the conversation. We're just really setting it up on what's happened. Where did public education come from? What's happened with things? Apart from prohibiting any voluntary religious instruction, are there any other things that we did not learn in public schools because of that decision? Things that our students aren't learning today. I mean, the decision to eliminate the Lord's Prayer, eliminate the Bible. What other things?
Well, there's a ton of things that went on the chopping block. For instance, the basis of the scientific revolution. What was the catalyst of that? Everybody thinks it was the Enlightenment and humanism and that, but what people don't understand is the basis of science as we know it today was because of how people viewed God, how Christians, the Judeo-Christian view of God, that is that God is a God of order. And so they started looking around, the scholars looked around and said, well, if God is a God of order, then we must be able to see that order in nature, in his creation. And if that order is in his creation, well, then we should be able to apply mathematics, which is all about order. We should be able to apply mathematics to the study of nature. And they did. And that is what created the foundation for science to flourish. But were you ever taught that in public school? No, of course not. They didn't want you to know that. In fact, your teacher themselves probably didn't know that.
And when you look at that, I mean, I taught math in seventh grade for a year. Was my toughest job I've ever had in my entire life. But it was so obvious that math works because of God. Everything in the universe is predictable because of math, which God created to make it all predictable. I mean, they know. My dad asked me this question. My dad's 89, and we watched that eclipse a few weeks back. And we were in Arizona, so we saw it perfectly, and we didn't have to stay up late to do it. And he goes, how do they know when it's going to happen? I'm like, because of math. They know exactly when the shadow of the Earth is going to go across the moon, and depending on where you are in the United States, whether you're going to have a full eclipse or a partial eclipse, it's all because of math. What other things? I mean, you had some big scholars in the past that talked about it. They looked at scholarly pursuits in light of God, and then some eliminated God. What other things aren't our students learning today?
Well, such as, what we're told is there was the Dark Ages and then the scientific revolution, starting mid 1600s or so, like with guys like Copernicus, right? But what they don't tell you is Copernicus didn't come up with this, ex nihilo, all of a sudden, oh, I have this inspiration. No, he built on the works of three prior scientists from the 13th and 14th centuries. Copernicus did not come up with this in a vacuum. He built on the work of prior scientists. Here's reality. Europe was scientifically ahead of the rest of the world, way ahead of the rest of the world by the 12th century, which we call the Dark Ages. There was incredible scholarship going on, which finally built and built more of discoveries and inquisiting about nature, beginning to apply mathematics to nature, until you finally come up with a guy like Copernicus. But Copernicus stood on the shoulders of prior scientists and prior scholars. And one of those three scholars he stood on the shoulders of was actually a bishop, of all things. So Christianity was critical to the development of science. And science started way before the scientific revolution. In fact, we should probably call it the scientific evolution, because it just grew over time.
Mm. All right. And again, you brought up another, just a quick aside, the Dark Ages. Why do they call them the Dark Ages?
Well, I think that the reason they call it the Dark Ages is because some secular historians decided they really wanted the credit for the scientific revolution to go to humanism and the development of humanism and the flourishing of humanism. And so, of course, they wrote history to reflect that narrative. But when you really go back and you study what happened, their narrative is wrong. The scientific flourishing came out of the belief that God is a God of order.
All right. So the scientific revolution was really the result of a Christian's belief about God and really of incorporating faith and science together, which we are told today that they have nothing to do with each other. What else weren't we taught in the last 50 years in school?
Well, you weren't taught about the real impetus of the Civil War, of the whole abolitionist movement. The impetus of the abolitionist movement was a belief in a God who holds us accountable and holds us responsible for our fellow neighbor. As Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. And the abolitionists looked around and said, we're not loving our neighbors as Jesus commanded us to. We have all these people that we're enslaving who are our neighbors. And so they began agitating and pushing and writing and speaking to end slavery in America, because they believed they were accountable to God and therefore responsible for their fellow man. But do you ever get that in the history books in public school? No. But that was the impetus for the entire Civil War and the overthrowing of slavery.
Well, they do talk about in public schools that it was about slavery, but they didn't talk about that really was a basis in morality. Hey, Jesus said to love our neighbor, and he told us who our neighbors were. The neighbors were the outcast in his society. I mean, it was...
Yeah.
All right, so Brad, what you're saying is things have changed in public education a little bit. In addition to prohibiting religious speech, ignoring how Christianity has shaped science and culture, what do they teach in public schools what else do they teach in public schools that is designed to undermine the belief in God?
Well, evolution. Whether you believe evolution or not is irrelevant. The reason for evolution in schools is because they want to undermine belief in God. Why? Evolution explains how we came into being without reference to God. And that's why they push it so hard. That's why they push it as fact rather than as a theory. I mean, when you really look at it, it's a theory. It has its strong points and it has its flaws, right? but they don't want to talk about the flaws. Why? Because they have a narrative, and their narrative is God is unnecessary to living life. He's unnecessary to life itself. You don't need God. That's the narrative for evolution. And that's why they won't debate the pros and cons of evolution. They don't want to do that because they need people to regard it as fact in order to see God as unnecessary.
And when you and I were in high school, they talked about the theory of evolution versus creation. And they actually talked about some of those things. Of course, they made people who believed in creation be, well, you crazy? But it was the theory of evolution. Today, they don't want to talk about the fact that it's a theory. Somehow it became a fact, even though they still can't prove it. All right. What other anti-God subjects are taught in public school system today?
Well, sex education, birth control. And you say, what do you mean? That is teaching us that God doesn't exist, that God is irrelevant? Well, yeah. Why do they teach sex ed? It's so that you can have sex outside of marriage without experiencing the consequences. God says there are consequences. They want you to be able to have sex without the consequences. And it's completely the reverse of what God says sex is for. Sex is to be within the bonds of marriage, and we go and teach sex ed so that our kids can go have sex and not experience the consequences of that. The other thing is, how do they define birth control? They define abortion as part of birth control. Well, of course, that's contrary to what the scripture says. Let me read to you a quote from Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood, right? You think birth control, you think abortion, you think Planned Parenthood today. Well, let me tell you what Margaret Sanger said about the purpose of abortion. She said, birth control appeals to the advanced radical because it is calculated. Jim, it's calculated to undermine the authority of the Christian churches. You see, Margaret Sanger understood decades ago that talking about birth control and abortion, as you push that into culture, it would undermine the authority of the church. That is, undermine the belief in God. And she said, I look forward to seeing humanity free someday from the tyranny of Christianity. Her primary agenda was to undermine the God concept of the country.
And it's all written down, but you don't see that quote posted on any walls anywhere. You're listening to the God is the Issue podcast with Brad Bright. We'll be right back.
Brad Bright travels the country speaking and training people how to make God the issue in every issue. Go to brightmedia.org, that's brightmedia.org, to find out how you can bring Brad's highly interactive workshop to your area. It's fun, engaging, and most important, it will help make you more effective in making God the issue in every issue. Go to brightmedia.org, that's brightmedia.org, and schedule Brad today.
Hey, welcome back to the God is the Issue podcast. As Brad and I are talking today about public education. Is it really incubating violence? We haven't even got that far. We're still just setting up what's happened to public education. And Brad, the last question about what's happened to public education, what's the bottom line? What's the real agenda? Why do secularists want to believe that God is irrelevant? Why do they want children to believe God is irrelevant? They want everybody to believe that God is irrelevant. Why?
Well, if we're created in the image of God, then abortion's highly problematic, isn't it? If we're created in the image of God, then racism is the result of sin, and it's not a result of a system. If God exists, then marriage is between one man and one woman. If God exists, then there are two genders and only two genders. If morality is an extension of who God is, then I don't get to decide what's right and wrong for me. Aldous Huxley put it this way. Let me read this quote. Aldous Huxley, who wrote Ends and Means and these, he said this. He said, the philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with the problem of metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do what he wants.
What do you mean by that? What does he mean?
There's an honest man, right? What he said is, look, philosophy isn't primarily about trying to pursue truth. It's trying to prove that you're right. It's trying to prove that what I want is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's trying to justify my behavior. And that's what he was saying. He was honest. He may have been an atheist, but he was an honest atheist. He admitted this is really a major part of our goal. See, the bottom line is they want to do what they want to do when they want to do it.
And if you ignore the fact that there's a God, then there's no moral code, and there's no moral code, then there's no sin. If there's no sin, then there's no guilt. And if there's no guilt, then you can do whatever you want without any consequences. But there are consequences, Brad. But we're out of time for today. I mean, we did all this time to set it up. We haven't even gotten to the consequences of what's happened because modern education has gotten where it's at. Can we hang on and do this in a part 2? Otherwise, this podcast is going to get really long. I think we should probably do the cliffhanger thing today. Are you okay with hanging on? Let's do this in a part 2.
Let's do this part 2 so we have the time to unpack it.
All right. I love that. Thanks for joining us today on the God is the Issue podcast, part 1 of public education. Brad Bright is, of course, our guest and our main speaker. Remember to check us out online at brightmedia.org, brightmedia.org. Remember, always be kind, compassionate, and shrewd, especially when you're frustrated, while making God the issue in every issue. It makes us stand apart as believers and makes God the most important thing in the universe. We'll talk to you next week.